Here's a place where all of us can be safe. Our stories of transformation can be safe, and all the things we want to research are safe here. This is Safe Space with Cheyenne. I'm really excited you're here, and I hope you stick around for a while, because I've got a lot to show you before I leave Earth. I love you guys. Hello, all my beautiful friends out there. Thank you for joining me today in our safe space. Today, I have Brianna Ladapo. Oh gosh, I bet I messed it up already. I'm so sorry. I'll let you reintroduce yourself.
Close enough. It's Brianna Ladapo.
Yeah, thank you. My worst fear realized I messed up a name. Today, she is coming on as the author of Emerging from Darkness, a spiritual memoir and a guide back to the light. And I just recently started this book because she so graciously sent me a copy when I asked to interview her. And I'm telling you, from the beginning of the chapter, I felt very seen and very connected. So she has come on today to not only share her story, but share her light and her mission to help others. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
I have so many questions, and I really hope I can just get them out all at one nice, easy flowing sentence for you. Me knowing your background as far as like where your childhood starts, do you want to start in the beginning with obviously feeling different and intuitively knowing?
Sure. Yes. So I was a strange child born into a deeply religious family. My mother's side was fundamentalist Protestant. My dad's side was fundamentalist Roman Catholic. And they were at war with each other long before I was born. So I was essentially born into this religiously warring family and both sides immediately started vying for excuse me, for my attention. They both wanted me to believe in their perspective, in their dogma, in their beliefs. And I was the kind of kid who was born talking to angels and having visions and talking to my guides. I had no idea it was unusual. When you're a child, you define the world through your own experience. So I just assumed everybody was talking to angels and their guides. And I would talk to them as easily as I'm talking to you right now. They were always there. And I would see things before they happened. And unfortunately, since I didn't understand that my family wasn't going to take this well, I would share with them what I saw. And they decided that I must be satanic. And they told me so. So they thought my gifts could only have come from the devil, but I must have done something I needed to atone for. So very early on, I was hearing, this is not acceptable. You are not acceptable. Even though very often, well, always actually, what I told them would turn out to be correct, whether it was something that I read in another person's energy and picked up in their field, or something that hadn't unfolded yet in our lives. And in retrospect, now I realize it scared them. They were reacting out of fear. But because the people that were supposed to love me unconditionally told me that I was evil and dark and unacceptable, I did my very best to shut down those gifts as a child, and it put me on a very dark path.
I love that you stopped right there, because I just wrote a quote from that part of the book where, you know, the lights went out. And I think it's a really relatable way that you wrote it, because I know that there's so many children that go through this, whether, you know, maybe it's not to the extent where like they see angels and they're talking to their guides and stuff. But I know that there's between probably like the age of 1 and 7, more up between 5 and 7, a lot of kids do have a lot of natural intuitive impulses that are shut down by the physical world. So the quote that I pulled out, you said, I began to suppress my gifts in earnest, believing that perhaps if I were more like them, they wouldn't torment me anymore and I would be safe. And just like that, my light began to go out. And when I read that, I was like, oh, my heart. Because I don't know like the actual age, but I assume it's between maybe like 10 and 13, 14, 15, somewhere around there. Like, when did you just get tired of kind of being demonized by the people that were supposed to love you? And you're like, okay, I'm just going to put my head down and fit in and listen to what they say.
That's a good question. It's sort of a moving target because the farther I get away from it, the harder it is to pinpoint.
Mhm.
But if I really go back to the moment that I gave up and I just didn't want to fight with them anymore, I think it was probably around 9. Um, that feels right. Because of course it was a process. When I was little, I think for all of us, when we're little and we look at our parents as these beautiful, benevolent beings that are supposed to care for us, we just trust, right? We put our well-being in their hands. And so if they denigrate who we are, it's obviously very painful, but we believe it, right? We have no reason not to. So I think it was about the age of 9. I had tried so hard. I felt like I was checking all the boxes that were important to them. I was going to church with them. I was the perfect student. I was never disruptive. In fact, I was nearly silent because it seemed everything I said triggered somebody. And finally, none of it was ever enough. So I just stopped trying.
And I think it's honestly still really powerful that you're like, okay, well, I'm still just going to try to be as good as I possibly can for you. In your mind, you're like, if I do what they say, I'll be safe. But most people react negatively and start being rebellious and pushing back. And you were like, well, I'm just going to get the good grades, be the good church girl, and listen to what you want from me. And I did not go that route with my story. So when I read that, I was like, oh, like when you hear something, you're like, I wonder if I would have done that, how that would have, what pathway that would have been, what multiverse would I be living in right now had I done that. So I also thought it was really powerful, given the level of spiritual intuition that you had, the level of energy that you had and perception you had at your age. And then still you were like, okay, well, I'm still just going to be good and do good. I just think that is profound because, again, that was not my experience.
Oh, thank you for saying that. But honestly, that didn't work either. You
Yeah.
know, it was no more effective than the other way would have been. And I did get to a point later where I became more rebellious and decided to just push back in every way. That was part of my dark journey. But at the end of the day, neither one produced the result that I wanted. I wasn't safe anyway. I wasn't happy anyway. And I was absolutely hiding myself. And it took me a good 30 plus years to learn that the only way to have true joy and be in true alignment and true divine gratitude is to be who you really are at a soul level. And to do that, you have to strip away all the trauma that creates ways of interacting with the world that are not actually yours.
That is truly powerful. And I feel you 100% on that. You are right. And I want to bullet point that right there because I do have some questions I want to come back, but I will skip so far ahead and miss the rest of the story. There was one of my favorite parts in the book where I was reading where you were younger. And I know you obviously didn't use chakra terminology when you were 9. That's something that you later learned the knowledge about, went back and went, oh, the energy was going through my root, my sacral, my heart, my solar plexus. And I love that you noticed that it got stuck in your throat, for one, because I know throat chakra trauma is a huge thing in the world, whether it's feminine or masculine collective. But you did these exercises as a child, just again, intuitively, where you would root your feet into the ground because you needed it to release from your body and push up through your crown. Do you have any memory or insight into what made you know to push that energy out that way?
It was mostly trial and error. I remember feeling overpoweringly like I had to sneeze. There was just something, there was energy. It was a big ball of energy and it just would get stuck. It wouldn't go anywhere. And it was really frustrating. Because you know how it feels when you need to sneeze or you need to cough or something needs to come out of you. So it was very biological and primal. And very often I would yawn or begin to yawn. In fact, it may happen right now. Forgive me if I yawn. It's the way that I transmute energy, so it's involuntary.
Mhm.
And I would start to yawn, and if it wasn't quite deep enough, the energy would get stuck right here. And it was so frustrating. So I remember trying to unhinge my jaw like a python and make myself yawn. I remember doing jumping jacks to try and shake it out because I didn't really know what the problem was, but I knew I needed to move this energy. So finally, I should tell you that I spent a lot of time in my childhood running away from my family. And we lived out in this beautiful area on a kind of a ranch like property with a lot of outdoor space. So I used to run away and find myself a little place in the valley nearby where I could be alone. And it just sort of happened. I realized after a while I was most comfortable there. I felt most connected to my angels with my feet in the dirt, my bare feet on the ground. And without the energies of other people, namely my family, interfering with my ability to feel, if I closed my eyes, that energy traveled freely. So it unfolded very naturally. I'm sure my guides were helping me out, helping me along, figure out what to do. If I had my hands on the trunk of a tree and my feet in the dirt or in the ocean, it flowed very easily. So slowly I learned that's what I needed to do is get still, get peaceful, preferably be alone. And this energy would burst out of me.
That's so profound as a child experiencing that. I always get like little memories that pop up when I read like similar experiences that I've had. And as I was reading it and you were talking about just how soulful you were with nature, it took me back to a memory when I was a kid where I had this tree at my dad's house. And as soon as I would get out of the car, I would like run and put my bags in and I would just go and I would set out on this tree and I would run out, walk out on this like really long branch that could support me. And I, like in my mind, I'm like the king of the jungle, right? I'm over it. But I just remember like running through the fields and always, always, always being in nature. So then right before I had my awakening where like the third eye visions like really came in and I was trying to scientifically prove that this was even possible or capable for a human being to, do. I started realizing the disconnect that I had had with nature for so many years, moving into deeper cityscapes. So when I started sitting down to meditate, one of my first meditations, like back to my inner child, was me in that tree and in that field next to our house where I would just roam. And I remember when I was a kid, I could just feel, Earth's energy just like moving through me, cleansing me. Like no wonder I was always happy all the time in nature. So again, I love all of the relatabilities that I can see in your story from when I was a little kid and just honestly how powerful your book is. I definitely want to go deeper into the story because I don't want to stop here, but there's so many things that I was telling you before we got on that I really want to pull apart and describe for people because whether you're a child or you're an adult, there is a mass awakening going on. And there's so many people, so many more kids that are being born with a higher vibration, I think is the easiest way to say it. And now, the same time that all of these higher frequencies are coming into our planet, we have more mental illness, more than we've ever seen. So I always want people to really question that and dive into it and just not take a mental health diagnosis as you're a defect and something's wrong with you and there's a chemical imbalance, because there's so many invisible things around us that have been discounted due to Western medicine. So your story does a wonderful job pulling those apart. Now, my question is like, what were the times like when you were a kid? Like, did you grow up in 80s, 90s?
Yeah, 80s. I'm an 80s baby.
Okay, great. Because now I'm like, I want to put that picture in everybody's mind too. Because like I'm a 90s baby for sure. And I definitely got my hit in the teenage years of the 2000s. But even when you go back further, it's just, there's no internet, there's no information, there's no way for you at this age to go on and be like, why am I seeing this? Or can you talk to angels? Like there really isn't a lot of research that you got to do back then either. So I love that because of that, you had to rely heavily on your intuition and the feeling in your body when something felt right or felt wrong.
I did actually have a quick funny story about that. So I very much was alone. And I think, like you said, at that time, we all were in a way, but I felt quite stranded in this family of deeply religious people who, and I say this with love, but they hid behind their religion as a way to not have to deal with the pain they were in. Because, of course, they were dealing with a great deal of trauma themselves. And religion is what they used to feel safe in the world. So I was really alone. And it wasn't until I stumbled upon a book by Dr. Christiane Northrup when I was about 8 years old. And when I was reading her account, and it was the first time I'd ever seen an experience like mine. And the way she described it gave me, this orgasms. It was divine chills. And I couldn't believe that I wasn't crazy. Because by that time, I'd really started to think that maybe they were right. Maybe my family was correct. And so it was amazing for me when all these years later, I was looking for someone to write the foreword to my book. And I was driving down the road one day, and a friend of mine called for no particular reason. And in fact, she said, if I think of you 3 times in a row, I have to call you. So we started chatting about our day. And she said she was on her way to do an event for Dr. Christiane Northrup, who is one of my heroes. And she said, I've been meaning to introduce you. And so the next thing I know, I get a call from her. And immediately it was like talking to a soul sister. And so that's how she came to write the foreword to my book.
That's beautiful. And she did a wonderful foreword. She painted you in such a brilliant light anyways. But now that I even know this backstory, I think it's even cuter that you guys just hit it off right away.
She was incredible. But she was really the first time I'd ever read an experience that reflected my own. So yeah, I definitely understand. Especially back then, there really was no internet. AOL was just getting started. I remember the ding it used to make when you finally got online.
Very true. Very true. Yeah, the dial-up internet is something kids of these days will never have to experience, or getting kicked off because somebody needs the phone or something like that. But that brings up a memory because, like I said, I know you didn't have the internet for your experiences, and I certainly did at a younger age. And when I was about 19, I would feel like this golden light go up my spine, and like all the energy would come out over my body. It was the only thing I could compare it to was honestly like a shrooms trip, because I had dabbled in psilocybin when I was younger. My friend gave it to me one time. He said, "You'll see a bunch of really cool stuff. Check it out." So I did, because I'm curious to a fault. That's my dark, right? And I remember like one being released from my suffering under the shrooms trip. And I was like, oh, this is so wonderful. I'm going to go sit out in nature and I'm going to go talk to Jesus. So when I got like my mind right and all that, I'm sitting on a tractor in the middle of the woods. And I was like, okay, Jesus, I'm ready to come talk to you. And he like just comes and floats and just stands there. And I just talked to him about all of the things that your first chapter really represented. Like, why are people in the world like this? Why do I want to be a nice person, but I feel, honestly, very vulnerable and weak being kind and caring and good, and just all of these internal questions that you have when there's such a harsh world around you. So fast forward to when I was 19 or 20, I started having this experience where, like, in my third eye, I did not have that definition, right? I could just feel this energy go up my body. And I was like, the only thing that I can compare this to is shrooms. And I'm sober right now. So what is this? And so I got on Google and I was just like, white light shooting up my spine, golden light in my hands, and I'm like, if anybody checks my search engine, they're just going to be like, we got another crazy one. But I was really like, what is going on? I'm having this real experience to me, and I can't like go to anybody. Like, I've never heard anybody be like, gold light shoots up my spine, I'm going to have a good day. So as soon as I put that into Google, it started talking to me about chakras and Kundalini awakening and Kundalini energy and universal energy and all of these very out there terms to me, because I was also in like a family that definitely believes that Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior, and they had all their different sects of religion depending on what family I was in. So I was well versed in the Bible, and I was well versed that anything outside of the Bible was just absolute nonsense, and they're all lost souls. Kind of, like they said it pretty nice, but they're like, don't go over there, don't do that. And I was like, okay, but this doesn't make any sense. We're all talking about God, but we're all mad at each other. So I do feel like very blessed that I at least did have the internet at the time. And I'm a really big journaler and writer. So I wrote all the information down and just dated it and time-stamped it, because that voice in my head was like, one day this is going to make sense. Like, this is just the beginning. I know it's super weird, but one day it's going to make sense. And I still have those notebooks. And when I went through my like transformative, powerful awakening in 2019, I pulled out all my old notebooks, and now I understood the definition of the chakras, what it actually meant, that they were real. They weren't like made up in some avatar cartoon type thing that my mind wanted to believe. And I could finally digest the information that I had written down for myself at 19 and 20.
That's amazing. Amazing that you had the foresight to do that.
I was very grateful for that. And that really got me into a lot of inner child healing and like past self healing, and just going back to those parts of myself and talking to her. And every time I do one of those, I'm like, thank you so much for writing, because I would have not remembered this. And I know that you could have easily chucked the information away and been like, oh, I can't comprehend it. It isn't for me. Let me go away. But I've always had that. Definitely my higher self voice is the best way I could describe it, where I'm like, I don't know why I'm keeping this right now. And they're like, it'll make sense later. Just put it away with all the other notebooks. We'll let you know when to pull it back out.
That's incredible. Incredible.
I bring that up because I want to talk to you about your intuition around the time that you said my light began to go out. So you were still getting the good grades. You were trying to do everything you could, but take us through the darker, like where this starts getting dark for you.
Well, this too was a long process, but at some point I stopped feeling the connection with my soul. And I had done a great bit to try and silence it. It's my own doing. I absolutely did this to myself. But whereas when I grew up, when I was little, every move I made was very much informed by my connection with spirit, whether it was my angels talking or just my gut. My gut has always been loud and decisive. In fact, the only times I've ever gotten into trouble is when I don't listen, because the answers have always been there. Mm-hmm. So when I started shutting all that down and I stopped accepting help from my angels or my guides, even nature or my higher self, I started making bad decisions. And it led to a lot of really, really dark relationships, a lot of sexual trauma, a lot of abuse. Eventually, I got very physically ill, and I ended up on all kinds of pharmaceutical drugs. I was so dissociated. I was completely numb. Mm-hmm. And I really have to credit meeting my husband for starting to shake me out of that. Because as anyone who's ever been in a relationship with someone they really care about knows, that person tends to act as a mirror for you, whether it's a partner or children or even a really good friend. Anything that's unresolved in you tends to start surfacing pretty quickly. Mm-hmm. So if I hadn't met my husband, I'd probably be dead, to be perfectly honest with you. I didn't expect to live very long, because after I shut out my light, all I could see was the darkness. Mm-hmm. Even after I went to Egypt and had some experiences, I detail them in the book. It's a very long story, but they really shook me awake. It's almost like the lid that had been on this simmering pot blew off, but it blew through the ceiling, and things became undeniable. And I started to allow my angels back in and my guides back in, and I started to wake up. I still had so much darkness and so much trauma, frankly, that was undealt with, that when my visions started coming back, they were very dark. It's like someone had opened a trapdoor to hell, and no longer was I having beautiful visions and seeing what I now know are higher dimensional experiences. I was seeing horrific tragedies before they happened. And it was I was really suffering. I got very, very depressed because I would see serial murders, plane crashes, awful things. And there was nothing I could do. I didn't know where they were going to happen. And even if I had, I wasn't quite sure how to handle that. You call up the local police and say, hey, guess what?
Yeah, I had a vision that this is going to happen.
I'm sure I would have eventually been arrested had I done that.
Absolutely.
So it wasn't until I was confiding all this in a friend of mine, and he said, you know, you can control what comes into your field, right? And I was like, no, I had no idea I could do that. And he gave me an incredibly simple exercise that actually solved my problem. And as simple, but it's so simple that I can't believe I didn't think of it myself. But trying that exercise actually changed my life because it was the first time that I had any idea that I had control over any of this experience. And that simple thing really set me on the path to taking responsibility for what I now understand is my co-creation of every experience I have ever had, past, present, and future.
Beautiful. Beautiful. And so relatable again. Like everything you say, I'm like, yes. Yes, you are saying it so right and eloquent. It's amazing.
Thank you.
So when you obviously started seeing all of the darkness and all like basically like the purging of everything that's been like pushed down, right?
Mhm.
And then this opening at the same time. So many ways I could go with that story. So I'm gonna move on. But what were besides the exercise that your friend gave you, what were some of the healing modalities that you were called to really peer into from, I would say, like your angels guiding you to heal?
Well, some of it was about returning to what I knew inherently as a child, getting back out into nature, getting still, getting silent, because I realized my intuition had never steered me wrong. I had always known what to do, and then I had actively blocked it out and completely derailed my life. Now, of course, I also believe at this point that was for a very strong and necessary reason. Without having done that, I would never have ended up where I am now. So I'm grateful for the experience and I don't regret it in the least. But that said, it took a lot of years for me to really make my way back. So I learned that for me, the ocean is an incredible way to neutralize dark energy and really enhance the gifts that I have. So I spend as much time as I can either in or looking at the ocean and with my feet in the sand, because when I'm in that space, I can actually hear my higher self. I can hear my intuition and my soul speaking to me. Um, and for some people, it's the mountain. For others, it's their garden. You know, it's whatever calls to your soul. And then another thing I knew inherently to do was turn off media, whether it's TV, social media, even there were types of music I had always listened to that I knew there was some little voice inside me saying, this is not good for you. This is introducing frequencies that are counterproductive and ultimately destructive to your awakening. So I slowly started to listen to that voice. I started to, I had, as I mentioned earlier, I got really, really sick for a number of years.
Mhm.
And of course, no doctor, and there were dozens. No one could ever figure out what was wrong with me. So they gave me so many different drugs, and I took them. Well, at some level, I didn't want to know, and I wasn't ready to deal with what was really wrong yet. So I took them, and I ended up completely dissociated. And ultimately, there was a moment, it was around Christmas time, and I was so sick and so out of it that I could hardly be present for my baby son. And I realized that I was going to die if I stayed on that path. And that if I wanted to heal, I needed to walk away from Western medicine and take responsibility for my own health and healing and wellness and my own journey. So I got away from all medications, all drugs, all stimulants, all depressants. So coffee, sugar, alcohol, everything, because I wanted to hear that voice inside of me. And I knew that all of those things were creating distance between me and source. So I started moving away from all of that. I stopped watching Netflix. And I'm not denigrating anyone's experience.
Mhm.
By the way, this is just what became apparent for me. I knew I needed to get silence around me because I couldn't hear. I couldn't see. I couldn't sense. It was like radio or static, like old school TV static all around me. And then you have people everywhere telling you what is best for you, whether it's newscasters or people on social media, these influencers. But the truth is, we all know what is best for us. None of us need to be told. It's about finally dropping into that space where you can really hear yourself at a soul level. So those are the things that I kind of knew to do. And then when I met Christopher, who's the healer I talk about in my book, who reminded me how to transmute energy. And I say reminded me because in this life, I really had no idea I was ever doing it. But it's certainly something that as a child, and I'm certain in many previous existences, I very well knew how to do. And it was the key to releasing my trauma. And he taught me some new things, or new to me anyway, that have helped me so much. And most of them are things I still do every day because there are always layers to peel back. This is a journey.
Very true. Very true. So, I don't want to give any spoilers away in the book, but do you say in the book what Christopher reminded you to do to really transmute that energy and block out the bad images?
Yes. Now, that being said, every experience, probably with any healer, to be honest, but I've come to realize that any experience with Christopher is completely individual. My husband had a remarkably different experience than I did. It was also incredible and very transformative, but the things he does and remembered and went through are totally distinct from my own experience. So I do detail my experience in the book, very much so.
Well,
But
I don't give it anything away then. I just wanted to make sure it was. How did your husband, how did he receive all of this? Because were you still like obviously still medicated when you got, like, you were still married, you had your kid, you were starting your life, and then all of this trauma started to surface? Would that be accurate? Like, when did it go from, oh, my wife, is on prescriptions and she's just trying to help herself out, to, oh, she's extremely spiritual gifted and it's just been shoved down in her body for so long?
So, my wonderful husband is a Western medical doctor. So he was trained, very rigid math and science, and he had no part of the spiritual world at all. He was raised very Catholic, as I was. And so when we first met, I think he probably thought that I was insane, to be honest with you. On our first date, we were having lunch, and the server came over, and it was very evident to me, because it was all over her field, it was in her energy, that she'd had a rough night. She was going through a breakup. She was having trouble in school. And I just blurted these things out. Didn't really mean to, but it was so obvious to me. So I said this to him, and he looked at me like I had three heads. But being the incredibly curious, inquisitive, and brilliant guy that he is, he decided to start interviewing our waitress. So every time she came back to the table, he'd ask her a couple more questions. And of course, everything that I had said turned out to be true. And I could see him trying to make sense of this in his mind. And it certainly, it's not something he could resolve with his medical education. So he got curious. And so it was many, many years. How many years was it? From that moment, it was almost 10 years later that we had our first child. And what really happened is, after we got married, both of our respective traumas started flooding to the surface. So we started falling apart. And it was ironic because we are so crazy about each other. I've never experienced a love like this, and neither had he. And that's still true, by the way. Now it's been 20 years, and he's still my favorite person. But we both had incredible amounts of damage. And a lot of it was sexual trauma, which is very tricky once you get into an intimate relationship. So our marriage started falling apart. And so that really started to happen even before I got sick and had my son. So he knew that I was this type of person. He knew that I had some gifts, even though I was actively trying to deny them. He tells me now that he never thought that I was quite human, which these days I take as a compliment. But back then I did not.
Back then it was triggering. You're like, oh no, you're like my family. You think I'm weird.
Yeah, it's like, oh, you're one of them.
Mm-hmm.
But he really wasn't. He too was a product of his environment. So anyway, it's a very long story, but the short version is our relationship started to implode. And we didn't want it to. We were actively trying to save our relationship. So we tried all these other things. We tried traditional therapy and programs like Landmark and Avatar and whatever self-help we could get our hands on. And we're both academics. So we read everything we could find. We studied every world religion there is in a desperate bid to understand and to fix it. And we didn't even know at the time what we were trying to fix. So by the time I figured out who Christopher was, we were on the verge of divorce. In fact, I was having a breakdown one day to a friend of mine, same guy who taught me the simple exercise about how to control the energy that was coming into my field. And that day, he had taken on a new partner in his practice. He's a healer too. And that guy had asked if he could sit in on my session. And I said, sure, help yourself. And to be honest, I'd kind of forgotten he was there. So I'm talking to this friend of mine and having a complete emotional breakdown and telling him that I think my husband and I are going to split up. I don't know what else to try. I've done everything I know how to do. So then this little voice in the corner pops up and says, excuse me, I know we don't know each other, but I have someone I think you should meet. And he described Christopher to me. They had gone through 20 years of healing, training, and practice in many different modalities together. And he said, well, he's kind of out there. So maybe you should read his book first and see if it resonates. And at this point, I'm willing to try anything. So I ordered the book on the spot. And when it arrived, I didn't even open it because his photo was on the cover. And I had the deepest soul resonance with this person I'd ever had with anyone other than my husband. And so, long story short, I described this to my husband. I got in touch with Christopher and we spoke on the phone, and I knew him. I couldn't even tell you how, because at the time I was pretty shut down, but I knew him. And I had never trusted a man after the way I grew up, what happened with my father and what happened in many subsequent relationships. I was terrified of men. So it did not make sense to my husband that I trusted this stranger. But he also knew that we had to do something or our relationship was over. So he actually went to see Christopher before I did. And the way he works is you spend a week with him. It's very intense. And what I saw in my husband, who, and he wouldn't mind my talking about this. He's written his own book and spoken publicly about what he went through, but he was so traumatized that any tiny bit of stress would trigger complete paralysis. He would freeze and his soul would leave his body. He would disappear. So it was like being married to Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And it was terrifying because this incredibly beautiful, wonderful soul would become very cold and very scary. So he went to see Christopher on a Monday. And when he came back that night, something seemed a little bit different, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But he was playing with my kids and smiling, which he never did. I don't think I realized till that day he never smiled. And he'd always had a dark entity attached to him since the day I met him. And the entity had moved with him a little bit. And then by Wednesday, his eyes were so bright, I felt like I'd never seen his eyes before. And he was laughing. And I couldn't believe it. This man, it was so stoic with laughing. And the entity was now a couple feet off of his body. So still present, but far. And by Friday, this entity was gone. He was completely present. He was the man that I always knew was here because I could feel his soul, but he was never able to actually be that in the world. And I was blown away. And that's actually what made me go see Christopher. So in a way, Joe and I have taken this journey together. So I do think he thought I was crazy for many years, but not anymore.
I love your story. Again, I have some relatable things, like when my husband thought I was crazy too. Like, I'm pretty sure you're crazy, but I love you. I fell in love with your soul, and we're going to figure this out together. And that was 5 years ago. And he has come a long way from the very left brain, masculine, logical, if I can't see it with my five senses, it's not real mindset. And now with all the experiences he's had, he was like, I'm going to do my own research on this. And even this morning, my sinuses were just so clogged up, and I'm like, this is out of nowhere. Like, I have an interview, and I want to be able to speak really good. I don't want to, cough or sneeze or anything. And he's like, oh, just do this exercise really quick. Just grab the top of your nose and this right here and hold it for a minute. And he stands there with his watch and he times it for a minute. And he's like, if you need to do it again, you can do it 2 more times. And that's usually my role, is to have some really cool EFT body function, breath work, juicing recipe to make everything right in your body. And he was like, oh no, I got you. He's like, I've been watching these videos from this doctor. And I was just like, you're so attractive right now. Like, I love you so much for teaching me something, and making sure it's me taking the power back with my body and helping myself. So I'm always interested when I meet such a strong feminine that really steps into her power, claims her gifts, no matter what. And then I'm always curious of like, what man is standing beside you? Because that has to be a very, very strong man, willing to go deep into his own stuff, but also be there for you to come back together. So you said it's been 20 years?
Yes. And it's been an incredible journey. And Joe, he is so remarkable. He's always been brilliant, but he was dealing with such a level of separation consciousness when we met, as was I, that to see his journey and watch him go from someone who thought meditation was nonsense to someone who just a couple weeks ago was on Tucker Carlson in his capacity as a public figure, talking about the darkness and the frequencies underlying the behavior we're seeing unfold on Earth, has been a pleasure and a miracle and an honor, because that man is the leader that, frankly, I think the world needs, or one of them. Of course, we do this together, but I am so proud of him, the way that he has really awakened and embraced the things that he doesn't know. And instead of approaching it with fear, like both of our families did, he approaches it with curiosity and an open mind. And of course, that's a lot easier once you're back in alignment. So stripping the trauma away makes that less of a chore, but I am so proud of him.
That's beautiful. I'm so glad you shared that. And good for him for being on Tucker Carlson and being in front of that many views, being able to speak like that. Because I know this terminology is becoming more mainstream and more normalized, which I'm very thankful for. Because again, years ago when I would study it, I'm like, if I talk to people about this would just be crazy. They wouldn't believe me. And I had one friend I was with, where was I? I was standing in a parking lot in Nashville, Tennessee, and we were staring up at the stars. And he said, can I tell you something? He's like, usually people look at me like I'm, kind of out there when I tell them this. And he goes into this like very theatrical with the hands and pointing up at the stars. And he's talking to me about universal consciousness. And it was the first time that I had ever had it presented to me that way. And I am not awake. I am very separated from mind, body, and soul, many soul fragments floating around. But anytime this guy spoke to me, like my intuition was always like, listen, because he's got something for you. He doesn't even know what he's saying to you, that it is for you, but it is for you. It's kind of one of those friends that pop in and out of your life. And he gets to a point where he's explaining basically, like the union of the cosmos coming together and how we're all collectively connected, like the collective consciousness, which is so profoundly known today, especially through Instagram hashtags. But he holds his hands up in the sky and he looks over at me and he goes, are you still with me? Do you get what I'm talking about? He goes, because this is usually where I lose people. And I'm just like I'm eating all of this information up. Like it's exactly what I need to hear and not necessarily understand at the time, but like bookmark this, they come back and they're like, you'll need this for later. Just keep it. You'll need it for later. And I still, like, as vividly as I can see it in my mind, just how excited he was to, like, not necessarily understand this concept, but it was one of his curiosities through his own personal experiences and whatever information he had come across that he was revealing to me. But when I, in turn, had my awakening in 2019 and I started realizing the collective consciousness is real, universal consciousness is real, thoughts are energy, everything has power, the importance of the masculine and feminine in both of our bodies rising in some energetic union format, my memory immediately switched back to us standing in that parking lot that night with his hands up in the air. And he's like, I got to hear the whole speech again. And I'm like, that dude knew years ago. I don't even know if he knows or believes in this at this point in his life, but who he was then, wow, he had some profound insights that I wasn't ready for, but God thought I was ready to hear from him that day. So even through like the healing process, like the retrospect, when you're going back in, like I love the memories that'll pop in and be like, we've been tapping you on the shoulder. We've just been using other vessels for many years. It's up to you to kind of like wake up and clear yourself out of this disassociation or this disalignment in your body. And I say that story because you've been with your husband for 20 years. You guys have been through the ringer multiple times. I love that you're like, I'm so proud of him. He's my favorite person, watching him grow. That's a really beautiful marriage and a really beautiful testament of when things get dark and like, hey, I don't even recognize you right now. Like, where did you go? That's beautiful that you guys fought through it. And there's a part of me, especially with like your dreams, your premonitions, your visions, that I know as women, sometimes we fall in love with the potential of what we see a man can be and become. Like we can see the blocks in them. And I'm sure they can see the blocks in us, but not on the same intuitive level. So in the earlier times, was it like, I know that you can move past this logical, only 5 senses in the world thing, and you can really open yourself up, like you said, with curiosity and open-mindedness and find this power in yourself?
Yes, absolutely. And my soul knew it before I saw him. When we met on a plane, and when he walked on the plane, I was in the last place in the world. I did not want a relationship. In fact, I had decided never to get married or have children about a week earlier. Oh no. But the way that I felt and the soul that I could sense in him was overwhelmingly beautiful and angelic. So even my first impression with him was so at odds with who he was showing up as in the world. And it makes perfect sense in retrospect. He also grew up in a deeply religious family, a lot of abuse. He went to medical school. He also has a PhD in health policy. He was trained about as by the book as it gets in terms of a Western interpretation of medicine and science. But there was so much more under the surface. And like so many of us, he was just trying to stay safe. He felt safe in the sciences. He felt safe with very factually based disciplines. And all the rest of this was completely foreign to him. But I could feel that on a soul level, he had come here to have this journey. In fact, we came to have this journey together. And I went from one extreme to the other. I went from not wanting any part of marriage, family, or a relationship to realizing that our connection is undeniable and at a soul level. And we chose to have this journey together for this reason. And he has taught me at least as much as I have taught him. We're very much a divine complement. But yeah, the incredible and beautiful nature of his soul was always clear to me. He just had trauma in the way, as do we all.
That's beautiful. I would love to just watch an interview with both of you, just bounce off of each other. I think you have really, really great chemistry just from the way that you talk about it.
Thank you. We do interviews together sometimes, and we do events together. We were actually both just at the American Academy of Environmental Medicine conference, and we spoke together. And honestly, it was a blast and one of the most fun events we've ever done, because in the room, There were people who were very extreme right brain and very extreme left brain. And so it was, I think, a new experience for everybody because we are such polar opposites. So we often arrive at the same conclusion, but we take very, very different pathways. So it was a lot of fun to speak for an audience like that, that is more typically medical during this great awakening where people are moving back toward an understanding of healing that has nothing to do with Western medicine.
Yeah, I was watching an interview about Dr. Joe Dispenza, and he's like, I have all of the scientific measurements that show all of this air quotes pseudoscience or alternative medicine or alternative healing is working. So I think we're at a point now that we can actually call it medicine and just call it healing instead of giving it an extra word to separate it from the medical industry that's already out there. And I thought that was profound and definitely needed to be said with a lot of, again, the expansion of human consciousness going on, people waking up and not having the Instagram idea of what a spiritual awakening is, right? Let me grab some crystals, let me meditate, and the universe is going to put my life in my lap and I'm just going to claim it as mine. You know, there's so many dark things that you really do have to go through and purge, and it's almost like a life review while you're still living. That's what I told somebody one time because I didn't know how to describe going back through all of the traumas or the disassociated parts of your life. Like you're like, you got to go pick those pieces up too. So the title of your book says, "And a Guide Back to the Light." So for anybody in your circumstances needing your book, what is the advice without spoiling any of the endings of the book? Because I definitely want people to go get it for themselves. What helped guide you back to the light? Whether it was Christopher, the intuition that you always knew, like what were some other things that you think people need to hear today to really guide them back to their own light?
Well, it was definitely a series of things that helped me along my path. And part of it was absolutely Christopher. Part of it was absolutely meeting my husband. Part of it was going back to Egypt, where I had been so strongly called and had no idea why. I went there and I had a series of explosive experiences, which I do detail in the book, that woke me up and made me remember. There is a vision that I had been having almost every night of my life for 30 years, and I thought it was a recurring dream. And when I got to Egypt and found myself quite accidentally, or not, in the place where that vision had taken place, I remembered my past existences that very much informed the experience I came here to have this time. So your guides they'll take you where you need to go. But that said, there are definitely ways to get there faster. And the entire last section of my book is about practices that you can take on right now with no extra money. They don't cost anything. They don't require any particular level of experience. All it really takes is time and commitment. But there are things that you can start doing today to raise your vibration. Because at its simplest, what we have to do is figure out how to be who we truly are, right? So we have to shed the trappings of trauma, of external influences, of or really anything that is not coming from our soul. So I don't want to give too much away.
Make them buy the book.
But I will tell you that the trick is to raise your vibration. And it sounds like this simple, to some people, woo-woo thing. But no, but your vibration determines your entire experience here. So by raising your vibration, figuring out how to change your frequency, you will change your entire existence. And it can happen quickly because you have to deal with your trauma. There's no way around that. You must figure out a way to deal with your trauma. Now, what that looks like is different for everyone, but I believe the thing we have in common is that trauma needs to be transmuted. So going to therapy is great, but talking about it and then leaving it sit there doesn't necessarily help anyone. You actually have to change that energy. You have to transform it from that dark, low vibrational energy that doesn't serve you or anyone into high vibrational divine energy that actually creates the life that you want and the world that we want as a collective. So that has to be done. So whether you can do it yourself, which many of us can, it's possible that all of us can with the right training. I don't know the answer to that yet. But it can certainly be done for you. So find someone who can help you with that, or learn how to do it yourself and raise your vibration, because I am living proof that you can wildly transform your experience. So if you think of your vibration as what's an analogy that will work? If you think of yourself as a radio, the radio is the vibration, but the frequency is the channel that you're tuning your radio to. And one of the first things Christopher taught me when I came in, so I came in and I told him for hours, I think, about all the sexual traumas I could remember. And he said, the first thing we need to do is change your frequency. And I had no idea what he was talking about. I was like, okay, great. Please knock yourself out. Do something, because I need help. And on the way in that morning, and I detail this greatly in the book, but the quick version is I had to walk through a construction site to get to his front door. And I'm sure that's not fun for any woman, but for me, it was a nightmare because it mirrored an experience I had had earlier in my life that was very traumatic. And so as I walked through this construction site, these guys who are acting typically, the whistling and the cat calls and the lewd comments and all of these things. And one man in particular was so disgusting that I can't even repeat what he said to me. So when I got into Christopher, he said, we need to change your frequency because you have the vibration of a queen, but your frequency is inviting everyone to assault you. And I had no idea what he was talking about.
Right.
So we go through our whole first session, and I get into what that looks like in the book. But after a while, he said, okay, we've transmuted some of that energy. Go outside, go have lunch or something. Okay. So I go down the hall and call the elevator, and this tiny little 2-person elevator opens, and who is inside but the man who had been the most vulgar a couple hours earlier on the construction site. And I thought, oh no, a lot of me really wanted to run, but I thought, nope, I'm not going to be displaced. So I stepped into the elevator and I was preparing I was certain was coming. But this guy stared at the floor and didn't say a word at first. I thought, okay. Finally, he said in a very tiny voice, excuse me, ma'am, I hope you don't mind my saying so, but you look very beautiful today. And I thought, what? Did something fall on your head outside? Because do you remember what you said to me 2 hours ago? And I didn't say any of this, but I was really trying to figure out what was happening. So anyway, I get out of the elevator. I walk back through all the other construction guys. Not a peep. No one whistles. No one says anything. Nothing. And a couple minutes later, as I'm walking down the street, I walk through this group of drunk frat boys. It's spring break in LA. So it's, even though it's relatively early, these guys are just hammered. And again, I'd had experiences earlier on that were deeply traumatic. So I'm preparing for the worst. But these guys parted like the Red Sea. And I was so surprised I dropped my bag. And one of them rushed it and picked it up and put it back on my shoulder. Said, here you go, miss. Have a beautiful day. And I was thinking, what kind of sorcery did Christopher do to me? What is happening? And anyway, it went like this for another hour. I had many more experiences just like this. So when I got back, I asked him, I said, what did you do to me? He said, we just changed your frequency. You're no longer advertising, please assault. And so that was the beginning of my understanding that we have control over what happens to us in our lives. So if you're having experiences that you don't want, if you keep having the same relationship over and over again, meeting the same kind of people, having the same unfulfilling or dysfunctional job over and over again, it is your frequency. And this is not a fault. We all have frequencies, right? It's a collection of our experience in previous lives, this life, the stress patterns we absorb from the people who raise us. It's a collection of a lot of things, but my point is that none of it is actually you at a soul level. So the moment you strip all of that out of your experience, you are free to be who you really are and have the experience you actually came to the earth plane to have.
Beautiful, brilliant. Buy the book. I mean, what more do you need to hear? This is beautiful. I'm so glad that you took the time to come here today and talk to us. But again, thank you so much for sending me a copy of this book, because I mean, I'm going to put it to really good use, and I can't wait to share this episode with so many people. And just thank you for really stepping into your power and doing what you need to do, because I know it wasn't easy. I'm sure you've lost a lot of people along the way that you cared deeply about, because I definitely know the sensitive souls in the world, they're born with the frequency of unconditional love in a way. And I think that's the saddest thing that happens when the gifts get pushed down, is they've accepted conditional love is what they deserve in this life. And then they operate out of that as well. So I know that you've worked tremendously hard to get to where you are from a frequency standpoint and even from a 3D standpoint. So I'm so honored you came to talk to us and share your story today.
It was absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. I love talking about all of this, and I never get tired of it. Thank you.
I love it. Well, if you write any more books, please come back and share all your wisdom with us.
I certainly will.
Wonderful. Alrighty, my friends, before we get out of here, I have a Novi track for you. If you've heard it before, that's fine, but you can go get it on that playlist. It's called Bang. We'll see you on the next episode, okay?
Lean into the pair of wandering eyes, wandering eyes. I am the fire to the flame, and baby, you're the gasoline.